Some hearts are born with cracks too wide for childhood to fill. For he was a legend, before the world ever heard the gravel in his voice or the aching beauty of On the Road Again. Willie Nelson was just a forgotten child in the dust of Abbott, Texas. Born in 1933 but left behind long before he ever had a chance to belong. His mother walked out first, vanishing from his life like smoke. No note, no farewell. His father, barely holding himself together, remarried and disappeared. 2. Willie was just a baby, too young to understand betrayal, but old enough to feel its burn. He and his sister Bobby were left in the care of their poor but kind-hearted grandparents, who did what they could to patch the holes in 2 children no one else stayed to love. It wasn't neglect, it was survival. But that survival came at a brutal cost. His grandfather, a blacksmith in the first person to ever place a guitar in Willie's hands, became the boy's only anchor, his quiet strength, his hero. And then when Willie was just 6 years old, pneumonia stole him away too. That death wasn't just devastating. It shattered what little security Willie had left. In his autobiography, he wrote with aching clarity, "Our separation from mother and daddy seemed worse than a death because they were still out there in the world. But they weren't with me and Bobby like they were supposed to be." How cruel, how cold, how impossibly painful for a child to know that his parents were alive, just not interested, not present, not reachable. The pain wasn't just grief, it was abandonment, raw and relentless. Most children cry for their parents when they're away. Willie cried knowing his were never coming back. By the time he turned 7 in 1940, he wasn't playing with toys. He was clinging to a guitar as if it were a lifeline. He didn't learn chords for fun. He learned them to quiet the storm in his chest. At age 9, while other boys were playing in the dirt, he was performing in local bars and with the Bohemian Polka Band, trying to turn pain into sound and sound into survival. He sang gospel in church, but even in God's house, he was a little boy singing not for salvation, but for someone to hear him. Every stage he stood on, even as a child, was less a performance and more a cry for connection. The music that later soothed millions was born from nights he lay awake staring at ceilings and asking himself why love always left, even decades later. That question haunted him. In interviews, he recalled, "There was always that silence. I filled it with song because no one else was talking to me." What kind of ache must a child carry to create an entire career from loneliness? How empty must a house be for the echoes to turn into lyrics? Willie never forgot those days. Not the way the Texas sun beat down on him as he picked cotton with bleeding fingers. Not the way hunger gnawed, not just at his stomach, but at his heart. By the time he reached adolescence, he had already seen more loss than most adults. Graves, goodbyes, and doors that never reopened. And yet somehow he kept singing, because if he didn't, the silence might have swallowed him whole. The sun in Texas doesn't just shine, it punishes. And for a teenage Willie Nelson, that blazing heat became part of a daily ritual, bending over cotton fields, his fingers blistered, his back aching, trying to pull something, anything, out of the ground to keep his family fed. It wasn't ambition, it was survival. By the time he was 14, sometime around 1947, he'd already cycled through more jobs than most adults twice his age. Tree trimmer, phone operator, nightclub bouncer, encyclopedia salesman, disc jockey. He scrubbed dishes, patched saddles, climbed poles, and hawked books door to door to families so poor they didn't even have a couch to sit on. In a later interview, Willie confessed, "I was selling a $600 set of encyclopedias to people who couldn't afford a decent meal. It didn't feel right. But when you're young, broke, and chasing something as fragile as a dream, you take what you can." He played in bars at night, spinning country tunes on dusty turntables during the day, and slept wherever he could, sometimes on floors, sometimes in his car, sometimes not at all. And Nashville, the place every country musician dreams of, slammed its doors in his face again and again. No label, no interest, no promise, just closed doors and long silences. Then came a moment so dark, so piercing, that Willie almost didn't make it through. In his 20s, living in a broken-down trailer on the edge of a cemetery near Nashville, overwhelmed by rejection, failure, and drinking too much just to sleep through the ache, Willie walked out into the night, into the middle of a usually busy street, and lay down. Not because he wanted to make a statement, because he didn't know what else to do. No one stopped. No one even noticed. The cars veered past him like he wasn't there. In that moment, life didn't flash before his eyes. There was just silence. Was I relieved? Was I disappointed? He later wrote. Can't say for sure, Bo. All I know is I got up, walked back to the bar, and had another drink. That is not the kind of story that ends in applause, but it is the kind of story that births legends. Because sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is simply stand back up. And Willie did. Not because he wanted hope, but because he couldn't bear to quit. One night, with no money, no car, and nowhere to sleep, he tried hitchhiking to Portland, Oregon, to find his mother. No one stopped. So he curled up in a ditch near the highway with his guitar beside him, rain soaking his clothes, wondering how much lower life could go. Then a stranger, a truck driver, offered him a ride and $10 for a bus ticket. Just like that, a lifeline. Not much, but enough. That moment became part of the quiet mythology that surrounded Willie. Not as a superstar, but as a man who refused to stay broken. He would later call those years a long storm, and it truly was. A storm without shelter, without compass, without applause. But somewhere inside that storm, Willie found something stronger than comfort. The raw, unfiltered truth that music was all he had, and it would have to be enough. Some men write history. Willie Nelson wrote its soundtrack long before the world even knew his name. In the late 1950s, after years of picking cotton under the cruel Texas sun, trimming trees to stay fed, and scraping by as a DJ and dishwasher, he still held on to his guitar like it was oxygen. He played nightclubs, sent out demos, and scribbled lyrics late into the night, lyrics that would someday define American music. But back then, no one was listening. It was 1959. Willie was broke, living in a modest apartment in Houston with a baby on the way. He had written a heartfelt gospel ballad called Family Bible, inspired by memories of his grandmother singing hymns around the dinner table. Desperate to buy groceries, he sold the rights for just $100. The song became a radio staple, a top hit for Claude Gray, praised for its raw purity and timeless message. But Willie's name wasn't even on the label. The applause came, but not for him. That heartbreak would become a pattern. Over the next few years, he would pen song after song, each one a masterpiece that slipped into someone else's spotlight. Crazy, a haunting melody drawn from the deepest recesses of pain and longing, soared to eternal fame through the voice of Patsy Cline. It became one of the most played jukebox songs of all time. Funny How Time Slips Away was recorded by Billy Walker. Pretty Paper found life through Roy Orbison. These weren't just songs, they were the emotional architecture of a generation. And yet, to the average listener, Willie Nelson was invisible. While his lyrics echoed through every bar and jukebox, the man behind the music was serving drinks, not signing autographs. Nashville wasn't just silent, it was dismissive. When he tried to sing his own truth, producers said his voice was too rough, too raw, too weathered. They said he didn't have the right look, no pompadour, no rhinestones, just braided hair, gentle eyes, and a face that wore every mile it had seen. They didn't hear the soul in the gravel. They didn't see the poetry in his weariness. They wanted polish. Willie brought truth, and for that, he was told he didn't belong. Imagine writing the soundtrack to someone else's success while being told your own story wasn't good enough to be heard. It wasn't just rejection. It was erasure. While other artists climbed charts on the back of his words, He walked darkened streets in search of secondhand guitars and sympathetic ears. He worked as a DJ in tiny stations, played backup in honky-tonks, and taught Sunday school just to scrape by. And still, he wrote. With every song he gave away, a part of him disappeared into someone else's fame. The heartbreak wasn't loud, but it was constant, the kind of slow ache that burrows into your chest and never quite leaves. For many, this would have been the final verse. But for Willie, it was just the silence before the storm. In the early 1970s, Nashville had quietly decided Willie Nelson didn't belong. His voice didn't fit their mold. His look didn't fit their suits. His songs were raw, spiritual, defiant, but they wanted polish, rhinestones, and radio predictability. So when RCA dropped him and critics wrote him off, he packed up what little pride he had left and drove back to Texas. His ranch in Ridgetop had burned to the ground just months earlier, a fire that felt more symbolic than accidental, like the final torching of everything he had tried to be for the industry. At 39 years old, broke and bruised, he could have vanished. But instead, in the quiet chaos of Austin, Texas, something unexpected was waiting. Austin wasn't like Nashville. There were no rigid suits, no rules about twang or tempo. In smoky bars and backyard stages, long-haired hippies sat beside rodeo cowboys. They didn't care if you looked like a rebel. They just cared if you sounded like one. And when Willie walked in, scarred by rejection, but still humming with poetry, they saw what Nashville never did, an outlaw. In 1973, he released Shotgun Willie, a ragged, unapologetic album that didn't beg for approval. It didn't care for radio. It just told the truth. And for the first time, people listened. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. That album cracked open the door. Phases and Stages kicked it wider. Then in 1990, he released Redheaded Stranger, a bare-bones concept album with haunting silences and stripped-down production. RCA had once told him to clean up. Columbia Records let him run wild. The result, a masterpiece. It was soft-spoken, almost ghostly, but every note landed like a confession. Critics called it unmarketable. Fans called it a revelation. That same year, he joined forces with Waylon Jennings, Jesse Coulter, and Tom Paul Glazer to create Wanted, The Outlaws, the first country album to ever go platinum. Suddenly, the man they once dismissed became the face of a movement. But this wasn't just about music. It was about defiance, about refusing to be erased. Willie didn't just sing about heartbreak anymore. He was proof that from the ashes of rejection, a new kind of fire could rise. He wore braids, smoked weed, played guitar his way, and dared to sound like himself. And in doing so, he gave permission to every other misfit, dreamer, and drifter who'd been told they didn't fit. Willie wasn't chasing stardom anymore. He had become something bigger, the voice of the unmarketable, the anthem for the discarded. The outlaw hadn't just found a spotlight, he'd built his own damn stage. And for the first time in his life, the world finally looked up and listened. But while the world was finally singing his songs, behind the spotlight, another storm was quietly building, one not even fame could shelter him from. Just as Willie Nelson was rising from the ashes of rejection, his personal life was crumbling under the weight of secrets too heavy to carry. At the time, he was still married to Shirley Colley, his second wife, a singer, a partner, someone who had stood by him through long nights on the road and longer silences in the dark. But then came the envelope. One quiet afternoon, Shirley opened a hospital bill by mistake. It wasn't addressed to her, but the name printed inside was unmistakable. The charge was for the delivery of a baby girl, born to Mrs. Connie Nelson. Shirley stared at the page. She didn't need to ask questions. The truth was right there in ink and numbers. Willie tried to deflect, to downplay, to soften the blow. "It's not a big deal," he said. "Just a hospital visit." But the bill said otherwise. He finally confessed in a quiet, defeated voice. Connie's my girlfriend. Paula's our daughter. That moment shattered whatever was left between them. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the kind of truth that leaves a scar no apology can erase. The marriage ended. And though he would go on to marry Connie, the cost of that union would linger for decades. Not just in headlines, but in guilt. Willie would later say, almost with a sigh, "There's no such thing as ex-wives, only additional ones." A line wrapped in humor. But beneath it, exhaustion, weariness, the ache of too many goodbyes. Around that same time, his beloved ranch in Ridgetop had already burned to the ground, a place he had poured his heart, his roots, and his hope into. It was all gone, his marriage gone, his label contract gone, Nashville gone. At just 40 years old, he found himself emotionally bankrupt, spiritually hollowed out, sitting in the ruins of everything he had tried to build. There was a moment, he would later admit, when he nearly quit music entirely, not because he stopped loving it, but because he feared he no longer had the strength to survive it. And yet, even then, something inside him refused to die. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the voice of a child who once strummed a guitar in a church pew, believing that music could still heal. But whatever it was, it pulled him back to the stage, even with a broken heart and a heavy conscience. And that's what made Willie Nelson different. Not just the voice, not just the songs, but the way he bled quietly, then kept walking through fire, through failure, through heartbreak, and never stopped singing. The flames didn't just take his home, they stripped away the last illusion of stability in his life. As his marriage crumbled and Nashville closed its doors, Willie wasn't just walking away from a career, he was stepping into the unknown, carrying only his scars, and a sound the world had never fully heard. They thought he was finished. A man whose voice was too raw, whose look was too weathered, whose best songs had been sold off and sung by others. By the early 1970s, Nashville had quietly pushed Willie Nelson out like a worn page from a forgotten book. His ranch in Ridgetop had burned to the ground, ashes and smoke where his dreams once stood. His marriage to Shirley Colley had collapsed in scandal and sorrow. And RCA, the last thread tying him to the industry, wanted him to bend or break. He chose neither. Instead, at 39, Willie Nelson packed up the ruins of his life and returned to the only place that didn't ask him to change. Texas? Austin wasn't waiting with a record deal or a shiny stage. It offered something far rarer. Freedom. The kind of freedom that smelled like beer and sweat in roadside bars, that danced barefoot on dirt floors under starlit skies. The kind of freedom where music wasn't manufactured. It bled, breathed, and burned straight from the soul. Austin in the early 70s was chaos and harmony all at once. Long-haired hippies strummed next to aging cowboys. Rednecks and radicals sat shoulder to shoulder in tiny venues that didn't care if your boots were polished, only if your song was honest. And in this wild, beautiful mess, Willie Nelson found home. No longer trying to impress Nashville, he wrote and sang like the man he truly was. In 1973, he dropped Shotgun Willie, an album that didn't apologize for anything. It was sharp, unpolished, defiant, exactly like the man himself. Critics didn't know what to make of it, but fans felt it in their bones. Willie wasn't chasing approval anymore. He was telling the truth. That album cracked the surface, then came Phases and Stages, a heartbreak concept album that felt like pages torn straight from his bruised soul. And finally, in 1975, he released Red-Headed Stranger. The record label thought it was a mistake. Too quiet, too sparse, too strange. But that was the point of it. It didn't sound like anything else. It sounded like Willie. That album, built on soft strums and ghostly silences, didn't scream for attention. It whispered, and the world leaned in to listen. It went multi-platinum, and the outlaw was no longer hiding. That same year, he teamed up with Waylon Jennings, Jesse Coulter, and Tom Paul Glazer to record Wanted, The Outlaws, the first country album to ever go platinum. Together, they weren't just playing music, they were rewriting the rules. Willie grew his hair, wore what he wanted, smoked what he pleased, and played like a man who'd been reborn. No rhinestones, no approval seeking, just a guitar named Trigger, a battered heart full of scars, and a voice that finally had room to echo. He didn't claw his way back into the spotlight. He built a new one with his own hands, his own chords, his own truth. And somehow in the wild heart of Texas, the world started to listen to the man they once told to sit down and be quiet. Willie didn't just return to music, he returned to himself. By the dawn of the 1990s, Willie Nelson had already done the impossible, risen from ashes, built his own stage, redefined country music, and become an icon of outlaw soul. But just when the world believed he'd made it through every storm, another one came. This time, it didn't come with fire or heartbreak. It came in the form of a letter, cold, official, unforgiving. The IRS demanded $16.7 million in unpaid taxes. Years of financial mismanagement, bad advisors, and blind trust had caught up with him. And in an instant, everything Willie had rebuilt, his ranch, his studio, his memories, was gone. Federal agents raided his home. They seized his prized recording equipment. They even took Trigger, his beloved guitar. To Willie, it wasn't just losing things. It was watching his entire life's work get boxed up and carried out the door. For a man who had already lost so much in life, this was a gut punch that could have finished him. But it didn't. Instead of hiding, he got to work. Willie didn't complain. He didn't blame. He didn't fold. He did what he had always done when the world knocked him down. He made music. But this time it wasn't for the charts. It was for survival. In 1992, with nothing but a stripped-down studio and his voice, he recorded an album called The IRS Tapes, Who'll Buy My Memories. The concept was simple, raw, honest, a man singing his story, offering up his past to buy back his future. No glitz, no production, just pain, memory, and melody, broadcast and sold directly to the public through late-night infomercials. And then something remarkable happened. America listened. Fans, old and new, rallied behind him. They bought the album, not out of pity, but out of love. They remembered the songs he had given them in their loneliest nights. And now they gave back. It was the kind of comeback no marketing machine could manufacture. Not a triumphant return driven by labels or producers, but by the pure power of connection. Little by little, dollar by dollar, Willie chipped away at the mountain of debt. He didn't declare bankruptcy. He didn't hide behind lawyers. He stood in front of his audience and sang, and they answered. By the mid-90s, most of the debt was paid. He got Trigger back. He got his dignity back. And more than that, he reminded the world again that resilience is louder than ruin. For most artists, the IRS tapes would have been a sad footnote. For Willie, they were another chapter in a story that refused to end. A man brought to his knees who found a mic and stood back up. Even legends bleed in silence. And for Willie Nelson, the deepest cuts came not from failure or rejection, but from the faces he could never see again. It was Christmas Day 1991 when time stopped. While millions lit candles, opened gifts, and embraced family, Willie received a phone call that shattered something irreparable. His firstborn son, Willie Nelson, had passed away under heartbreaking circumstances. Billy had been working on a gospel album, a reflection of faith and fragility, but behind closed doors, a quiet storm had been raging. Willie would later say in the simplest and most devastating of words, "I've never experienced anything so devastating in my life. There are no songs for a pain like that, no melody for a silence that deep." For years after, every note he strummed carried an echo of Billy's voice, a memory unfinished. And every Christmas since, behind the lights and the laughter, there lived a father's ache, quiet but unrelenting, a wound dressed in music, but never healed. He stopped playing Christmas shows for a while, And when he returned, it was never quite the same. Fans say they could hear it in his voice, a weight behind each lyric, a quiet pause where there never used to be one. And that empty chair at every family gathering, it still sits there. Then came February 2020. The world was just beginning to whisper about a virus. But Willie was already bracing for a different kind of loss, the kind that had been circling him for decades. Paul English, his drummer, bodyguard, outlaw companion, and brother in spirit, passed away at the age of 87. Paul wasn't just a bandmate, he was family. They met in 1955 when Willie was still sleeping in cars and playing for change. Paul showed up with a pair of paintbrushes and a cardboard box, claiming he could drum, and somehow he did, through bar fights, empty wallets, and endless highways. Paul was there. Willie once said, "If I hadn't gone with Willie, I'd be in the penitentiary or dead." And it wasn't a joke. Paul carried cash, guarded the band, settled scores, and sometimes collected debts with a pistol in his boot. But more than anything, he was Willie's anchor in the madness. He was the kind of man who didn't flinch in chaos. When bandmates argued, Paul didn't speak. He just gave a look, and silence fell. After Paul's death, Willie's daughter Amy called him the co-patriarch of their family. He wasn't just keeping time on the drums, he was keeping the family together. And when that beat stopped, something in Willie's world fell silent, too. On stage, the band kept playing, but to Willie, something was missing in the rhythm, something that could never be replaced, only remembered. 2 years later, in 2022, that silence deepened. His sister, Bobby Nelson, passed away. Bobby wasn't just his sibling, she was his first duet, his first bandmate, his lifelong musical shadow. Together, they were raised by their grandparents after being abandoned by both parents. It was Bobby who stood beside him at the family piano, who played on his first records, who knew every scar he'd carried since childhood. They co-authored a book together, Me and Sister Bobby, a love letter to resilience in music. In that book, Willie wrote, "Without my sister, I'd never be where I am today. I've always needed her." When she died, it wasn't just a loss. It was the collapse of a bridge to everything he used to be. She wasn't just part of his music. She was part of his memory, a witness to the years nobody else remembered. When Bobby left, Willie didn't just lose a sister, he lost a historian, a keeper of truth, a lifelong harmony. He still plays her favorite songs, but he plays them slower now, as if waiting for a note that never arrives, as if hoping to hear her voice in the echo. And then, as if fate wasn't finished, came the final blow. In September 2024, Chris Christopherson, Willie's brother-in-arms, fellow highwayman, and soul confidant, passed away at 88. Their friendship wasn't just professional, it was cosmic. Two poets who refused to be polished, who lit the outlaw fire that still burns today. Together with Johnny Cash and Waylon Jennings, they became the Highwaymen, a supergroup of rebels who didn't just sing about freedom, but lived it. Chris was the Harvard graduate who swept floors to pitch songs. Willie was the Texan drifter who turned pain into poetry. They were misfits made for each other. They shared the stage, the road, the backstage jokes, the bad hotels, the quiet moments before the curtain rose. After Chris passed, Willie said he left a lot of fantastic songs around for the rest of us to sing. I hated to lose him, but it wasn't just about songs. It was about losing the last voice that truly understood his. With Johnny, Waylon, and now Chris gone, Willie stood alone, the final highwayman. Fans might see his signature braids and gentle smile and think nothing's changed. But when you look close, you see it, a flicker in his eyes, a weight in his shoulders, the weariness of a man who's seen too many sunsets with one less friend beside him. And so now at 92, when Willie takes the stage, something is missing. Or rather, many things. He still smiles, he still strums, but behind that calm warmth is a man walking through a graveyard of memories. The crowd sees a legend. But on stage stands a father without his son, a brother without his sister, a band leader without his beat, and a poet without his muse. They say time heals, but some wounds simply learn how to sing, and Willie somehow still does. He does not wail. He does not collapse. He does what he has always done, turns grief into melody, sorrow into verse, and as long as there is breath in him, there will be a song, a conversation with ghosts, a prayer through chords. This is not just a story of loss. It's a story of endurance, of love that outlives bodies, of grief that shapes melodies, of one man who continues to walk on, carrying the ghosts of his greatest companions in every chord he plays. If his music has ever touched you, know this: every song now is a conversation with the ones he lost, every lyric a whispered prayer, every performance a eulogy with rhythm. And maybe that's why Willie Nelson is still here. Not to escape the pain, but to transform it into something the world can hold. There's a quiet war that rages behind Willie Nelson's weathered smile, one that doesn't show up in headlines or album charts, but it's there, written in every breath he takes, long before he became an outlaw legend. His battle with health had already begun. In a haunting admission from his memoir, Willie recalled swapping eggs from his family's chicken coop for packs of Camel cigarettes at just 6 years old. What started as a child's imitation of adulthood soon became a lifelong shadow. That shadow grew darker with time, taking its toll not just on him, but on those around him. Cigarettes, he later confessed, claimed the lives of his mother, father, stepmother, and stepfather. Half the people in my family, he wrote, were killed by cigarettes. Yet for decades, he couldn't quit. He sang through the smoke, toured through the wheezing, and smiled through the burn. It wasn't until much later, when the damage had become irreversible, that he made the change. Willie was diagnosed with emphysema, a slow, merciless disease that eats away at the lungs, making every breath a conscious effort. In 2015, with his health declining rapidly, he underwent a stem cell operation to repair some of the lung tissue. By then, the years of wear and tear had caught up with him. He had suffered a collapsed lung, and rumors of retirement loomed in the media. But even as his body warned him to slow down, his soul refused. "I don't feel bad," he told the press. "I don't hurt anywhere. I don't have any reason to worry about dying." The words sounded fearless, but they were also laced with weary wisdom. Though he finally gave up tobacco, Willie turned to marijuana, not out of rebellion, but relief. It dulled the pain, eased the inflammation, and kept his spirit light even when his lungs were heavy. For years, his relationship with weed became as iconic as his music: braids, bandana, and a joint in hand. But even that chapter had to close. When smoking anything became too dangerous, he shifted again, this time to edibles. It was a quiet, almost poetic transition. The fire was gone, but the spark remained. Willie had found a way to adapt without surrendering who he was. But perhaps what's most powerful isn't how he's suffered, but how he's endured. The public sees the performer, the legend, but those closest to him see something else. A man who wakes up in pain yet picks up his guitar anyway. A man who's lost breath yet still sings. A man whose voice has thinned but whose soul grows louder. He's had to cancel shows, take breaks, and retreat to the quiet of his Texas home. But he always comes back. Always. In the eyes of his son, Lucas. Willie's resilience is more than stubbornness. It's purpose. "That's what makes him inspiring to me," Lucas said. His resilience in the face of adversity. For every scar on his lungs, there's a verse he's written in its place. For every diagnosis, a new chord struck. At 92, most men count pills. Willie counts down to his next show. He no longer moves with the ease he once did. His gait is slower, his frame leaner, but there's still a spark, a gleam in his eyes that refuses to dim. His health may have betrayed him, but his spirit hasn't. He's not just surviving, he's transforming suffering into legacy. Because when you face your own breath as an enemy and still choose to sing, you become something more than an artist. You become a testament. And in every whisper of air he draws today, Willie Nelson carries the story of what it means to keep living, even when the body begs you not to. At 92 years old, Willie Nelson lives a life that feels more like a poem than a retirement. Far from fading into obscurity, he has carved out a peaceful existence on a private ranch nestled in the heart of Texas, a place where the wind hums through the trees like the strings of his old guitar. Surrounded by open skies, fields, and animals, Willie's home is not just a property, it's a refuge. The ranch itself, though, located near Spicewood, Texas, spans hundreds of acres and is estimated to be worth over $3 million. Modest yet steeped in history, it houses not only his cherished belongings, but the echoes of a life forged through both fire and harmony. Inside, the home is filled with memorabilia from decades of music and memories, but it's the people inside who matter most to him now. Family has become Willie's world. His children, especially Lucas and Amy, play an active role in his life and art. Lucas, a talented musician in his own right, often shares the stage with his father, carrying forward the legacy not just in sound, but in spirit. Amy, too, walks the musical path. Their performances together aren't just concerts. They're conversations between generations, echoes of Willie's early days, this time surrounded by love and continuity instead of uncertainty. Physically, Willie's body bears the marks of a lifetime on the road. He's thin, his skin worn and folded by time, but his eyes still shine with that unmistakable twinkle, a mix of mischief, peace, and hard-earned wisdom. Though once a heavy smoker, he quit tobacco and later gave up smoking marijuana, turning instead to edibles to ease the aches of age. His emphysema diagnosis years ago forced him to take his health seriously, leading to a 2015 stem cell treatment that helped stabilize his lungs. Today, he maintains his well-being with a simple but disciplined lifestyle: organic food, light yoga, meditation, herbal supplements, and long walks around the ranch. He doesn't chase youth, he honors age. Financially, the man who once lost everything to the IRS has rebuilt his fortune with remarkable resilience. Tour revenues, royalties, product endorsements, and a successful line of CBD products have made Willie a quietly wealthy man again. Not that he flaunts it. As of 2025, his net worth is estimated between 25 and 30 million. The revenue stems not only from his legendary catalog and live tours, but also from Willie's Remedy, his successful CBD product line, and a modest real estate portfolio in Austin. His ranch alone contributes a significant portion of that worth. He wears the same old boots, rides the same beat-up tour bus, and still carries his beloved guitar trigger, now scarred and sacred, wherever he goes. That guitar, much like Willie himself, has been through fire and thunder, and yet it still sings. In April 2025, he released his 76th solo studio album, The Last Leaf on the Tree, produced alongside his son, Micah. The album isn't just a collection of songs, it's a statement of presence, of survival, of reflection. Each track dives into the reality of aging, the weight of loss, and the lightness of letting go. But it's not somber, it's soulful. It's not a goodbye, it's a grace note. The record is being hailed by critics as one of the most profound late-career works in country music history. Despite his age, Willie continues to perform live. In October 2024, he stunned the world by appearing on stage in Texas with none other than Beyoncé. The image of him, slender, steady, strumming trigger beside a global pop icon, was more than a performance. It was a cultural bridge, a moment that reminded everyone of the timelessness of authenticity. Willie is now the last living member of the Highwaymen, the legendary country supergroup. He carries not just his own memories, but theirs too, like echoes etched into every note he plays. He hasn't officially announced a will, but those close to him confirm that he's quietly arranged his affairs. ensuring his children will inherit not just his estate, but the spirit of his music. Willie's perspective on death remains as calm and grounded as his music. "I don't hurt anywhere. I don't worry about dying," he told the Associated Press in 2025. It wasn't a boast. It was a reflection of peace earned through decades of storms weathered and souls mourned. He no longer fights time. He welcomes it. Old age, illness, and death are immutable laws of nature. None of us can escape them. And Willie, the man who once embodied strength, charm, and the image of Hollywood's quintessential leading man, is no exception. The marks of time now rest on his face, in his slower steps, and in each breath he takes, as if to remind us that all glory must eventually fade, giving way to an inevitable decline. Yet, the beauty of a life is not measured solely by its years of triumph, but by how we accept and confront those harsher truths.